Europe ended up with a very unusual political system. Most political systems start with a constitution. A single document explains who has authority, which institutions exist, how laws are made, and what limits exist on government power. The European Union does not work that way. Its legal structure was built gradually through agreements between governments, beginning with the Treaty of Rome in 1957 and later expanding through the Maastricht Treaty and eventually the Treaty of Lisbon. Each treaty added new institutions, new rules, and new areas where countries agreed to cooperate. Over time, these treaties began to function like a constitution, even though they were never written as one single constitutional document. That distinction matters more than it might first appear. A constitution usually comes from a political community deciding how it wants to govern itself. In the European Union, the rules were negotiated mainly by governments representing their states. The system, therefore, reflects agreements between national leaders rather than a single shared European political foundation. It still works in many areas. The trade rules, competition law, environmental standards, and product regulations are coordinated across dozens of countries, but the deeper constitutional structure remains layered and somewhat unclear. Authority sits partly with national governments and partly with European institutions. And because the system was built piece by piece over decades, the boundaries of power are sometimes negotiated after problems appear rather than clearly defined beforehand. At one point, European leaders tried to solve this confusion. In the early 2000s, they proposed a treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. The idea was fairly straightforward: replace the complicated set of treaties with a single constitutional document that clearly defined the authority of European institutions and the relationship between the Union and its member states. In theory, this would have simplified governance and improved democratic transparency. But something interesting happened. Voters in France and the Netherlands rejected the proposal in referendums in 2005. That moment revealed a deeper tension. Many citizens were comfortable cooperating economically with their neighbors. They supported open trade, shared regulations, and coordinated standards. But a centralized constitution structure felt different. It suggested that the possibility of a federal political system, something closer to a single European state. After those referendums failed, European leaders stepped back and negotiated the Treaty of Lisbon instead. Lisbon preserved many institutional reforms, but avoided presenting them as a constitution. So, in practical terms, the EU kept functioning, but the constitutional clarity that the original proposal aimed to create never fully materialized. Europe returned to operating through a complex framework of treaties layered on top of one another. That layered structure has consequences for sovereignty and security. European law operates under a principle known as legal primacy, meaning that EU law can override national law in certain policy areas where countries have agreed to transfer authority to the Union. This principle has been reinforced repeatedly by the European Court of Justice. The system allows the EU to maintain a unified single market where businesses follow consistent rules across borders. But national constitution courts sometimes push back where they believe European institutions exceed their authority. The German Federal Constitutional Court has occasionally argued that Germany's constitution remains the ultimate legal authority within its territory. Similar tensions have appeared in debates involving Poland as well. What this reveals is that Europe's governance system operates through ongoing negotiation rather than final constitutional settlement. It functions often quite effectively in areas like trade, banking, regulation, and cross border standards. But the deeper question of where ultimate legal authority resides remains unsettled, and where questions about security policy, border control, or financial governance arise, that uncertainty sometimes becomes visible. The system keeps operating, but the constitutional lines remain blurred. If we look at the last 5 years, it is easy to get caught in the frustration of thinking the EU just meets, negotiates, and produces reports that never feel quite tangible. There is a perception among civilians, and it's not entirely wrong, that they are paying for a bureaucratic machine where decisions are made by people who were never directly elected by them. And there is definitely some truth in that. The European Commission, the body that proposes and enforces EU law, is composed of commissioners nominated by national governments. The European Parliament is elected, but its power is still balanced against the Council of Ministers, which represents member states' governments, and the Commission itself, which is unelected. So when people ask, why am I paying for this? Or when does the EU actually come to the rescue? They're asking a very practical question. For instance, during the migration crisis of 2022 to 2023, the EU coordinated funding, border support, and refugee settlement programs across several countries, but the speed of enforcement varied widely. Some countries implemented measures promptly, others delayed, creating a patchwork of outcomes. Similarly, the EU's response to Russia's 2022 campaign in Ukraine involved coordinated sanctions, financial aid packages, and military support measures, but the timing and the impact on individual member states were uneven. From a systems perspective, the EU's strength lies in coordinating collective action and sharing risk across borders, but the benefits are often dispersed, they're incremental, and behind the scenes, which makes it harder for the average citizen to perceive them as direct gains. Essentially, the EU is effective when crises require collective resources, but the visibility and speed of the outcomes are uneven, leaving some people questioning whether their investment in the system is even worth it. And that perception ties directly back to the underlying constitutional ambiguity. When authority is layered, enforcement and accountability tend to be harder to measure. Security governance shows a similar pattern. The EU does not operate like a national military force. Instead, it relies on coordination mechanisms such as the Common Security and Defense Policy to align member states' military and strategic capabilities. So, in practice, that means coordinating training exercises, joint missions, intelligence sharing, and resource pooling. From a citizen's point of view, it's easy to think that the EU isn't taking action directly, but the system seems to work because it centralizes planning and resources while leaving execution to the states. It's also worth noting that this arrangement balances two competing needs: national sovereignty and collective security. Each state keeps control over its own forces, which addresses domestic concerns about autonomy, but the EU can still exert influence and coordinate responses across borders. This dual structure is both a strength and a weakness. Strength because it allows diverse states to cooperate without ceding too much power. Weakness because responsibility is diffuse, and citizens sometimes see inefficiency or delayed action. The system effectively amplifies the capabilities of member states collectively, but individuals rarely feel that amplification directly. It's an example of institutional power operating at a systemic level, where control is distributed and influence is indirect, which is exactly why constitutional clarity matters. Without it, disputes over who can act and who must follow procedure emerge every time a crisis tests the system. And here is where it becomes interesting. The EU delivers real benefits, but they are structural, they are often invisible, and it's hard for the public to quantify in daily life. Take financial stability, for example. Over the past 5 years, the EU has coordinated stimulus packages to stabilize member economies after COVID era disruptions. Countries like Italy and Spain received support through the Next Generation EU Fund, which financed infrastructure, digitalization, and energy transition projects. These interventions protected jobs, they encouraged investment, and stabilized national budgets. Citizens might not notice that without the EU, these countries would have faced deeper recessions or maybe currency instability. Another example is regulatory harmonization. Product safety, environmental standards, and financial regulations are aligned across the union. Businesses gain predictability, citizens gain consumer protection, and the EU gains leverage in global trade negotiation. But, and this may be subtle, but because the system's authority comes from layered treaties rather than a single constitutional framework, member states retain significant discretion over implementation. So the courts, parliaments, and national governments can interpret EU directives differently, creating either gaps or delays. That ambiguity is a recurring theme. The EU shapes the outcomes, but the diffusion of power means that no single actor is fully accountable, which leaves citizens questioning whether the resources they contribute are justified. It's a structural paradox. The EU strengthens collective security and economic stability while appearing weak to individuals who are paying for it. It is simultaneously effective and opaque, it's protective and distant. In essence, the system works best as a network of interdependencies rather than a centralized authority. So that creates resilience, but also persistent uncertainty about ultimate accountability and sovereignty. So, what we see then when we look at the EU's treaty based constitution is that constitutional ambiguity is both a feature and a consequence. It allows a hybrid system to operate where authority is shared, but it also limits transparency. National governments maintain a significant degree of sovereignty, which protects them from being overruled in domestic affairs, but it also limits the union's ability to act with decisiveness of a single state constitution. In some cases, this has prevented overreach, which is positive, but in other cases, it slows collective action and blurs responsibility. The system works through ongoing negotiation and interpretation rather than through codified clarity. Citizens experience benefits indirectly, like safer borders, financial stability, harmonized standards, coordinated crisis response, but they also experience frustration when outcomes are delayed or uneven. The EU structure reflects a balancing act between cooperation and autonomy. It is effective in delivering collective goods, but its hybrid legal identity leaves everyday people questioning its value and fairness. And when leaders recommend policies or aid packages, the effectiveness depends on implementation at the national level, leaving perception and reality out of sync. This ambiguity also reshapes where power flows. Because the EU functions through negotiations among states, and because treaties are interpreted by institutions like the European Court of Justice, the distribution of influence is subtle. Countries with larger economies or more strategic leverage, such as Germany, France, Italy, have more sway over how rules are interpreted and implemented. Smaller member states benefit from the protections of collective agreements, but their influence tends to be limited. Corporations and industry associations also exploit regulatory uncertainty to lobby favorable outcomes across borders. The system becomes a layered network where power resides not just in formal institutions, but also in the interactions between states, courts, and private actors. Citizens may notice inefficiencies or delays, but the structural design ensures that most disputes are contained within institutional channels rather than producing chaos. In this way, constitutional ambiguity redistributes influence in ways that a traditional constitution might not. It allows flexibility, but it also generates persistent opacity. So, when we step back and think about the European Union as it exists today, it is a system. built on treaties rather than a single constitutional document. It functions well enough to coordinate trade, maintain the single market, stabilize economies, and facilitate security cooperation. It protects national sovereignty to an extent, while also providing collective benefits that would be difficult for individual states to achieve alone. But the lack of clear constitutional hierarchy creates ongoing tension between authority and accountability, between European institutions and national governments, between citizens and the bureaucracy they fund. It is effective where networked coordination matters most, but it is less effective at creating clarity, decisiveness, or public understanding. And that tension between institutional strength and legal ambiguity is at the core of why many analysts argue the EU has not delivered true constitutional clarity. At the end of the day, the question is less about whether the EU is good or whether the EU is bad, more about understanding the flows of power within that system. Who bends the rules? Member states and European institutions. Who maintains the system? National courts, parliaments, and the European Commission. Who benefits? Larger states, mostly industries, and citizens indirectly through economic stability and shared resources. The ambiguity allows flexibility, and flexibility can be a strategic advantage, but it also makes it hard for civilians to feel confident that the system is fully accountable when crises appear, whether it's economic, military, or social. The speed of enforcement is constrained by the layered authority. The system shapes outcomes quietly through negotiation and interdependence rather than through a single clear chain of command. So power flows not just through formal law, but through interpretation, influence, and systemic leverage. I wonder, could constitutional ambiguity actually be the EU's source of resilience while simultaneously hiding its true influence? Citizens may feel powerless, but in practice, the network of treaties, institutions, courts, and state interactions redistributes authority in ways that preserve both sovereignty and collective functionality. That is the subtlety of the system. It delivers tangible outcomes like financial stability, trade integration, coordinated security, while remaining legally opaque enough to prevent dominance by any single member state. The EU's hybrid structure shapes where power resides, how it can be exercised, and who can influence outcomes. And in a global context where financial systems, technology networks, and international norms define leverage, constitutional clarity may be less important than the system's ability to operate through negotiation, adaptation, and interdependence. The question to return to is, as the EU evolves, as treaties are interpreted, and as institutions adapt, who ultimately gains power from these networks? The answer is embedded in the system itself, not in headlines, not in speeches, and definitely not in formal constitutional texts, but in the continuous interaction of authority, enforcement, and interdependence that defines European governance.